God created nature, and then it fell, and then he redeemed it by grace. And so there's always going to be in Christianity kind of a looking upwards to God and then a looking downwards at what he has made and then seeing the whole. And so to a certain extent, if you can see how the philosophers, like the scientists of today, can often be very insightful in studying and looking down and studying nature.
David Talcott, welcome to Flames and Crowns. Grateful that you could join me out here to talk about an all-important subject. I think something that is worthy of reckoning with and thinking through very deeply. At present, we're facing all kinds of struggles in the Western world at large, and I think that there's a lot that we can learn from the ancient world, and specifically as it relates to ancient philosophy. So I really want us to just kind of camp out and talk about lessons that we can learn from the ancient world. Now, of course, you've done quite a lot of work in relation to Plato and sexual ethics. Those are things that we were just talking about a moment ago. But just give us a bit of background with regard to where you've been, who you are,
Sure.
and what it is about this specific subject that interests you so much.
Sure. Yeah, happy to. So I'm David Talcott. I've been here at New St. Andrews for 2 years and teaching philosophy. That's my background. All of my academic degrees are in philosophy, an undergrad degree from Hillsdale College and then PhD from Indiana University, Bloomington. I taught at the King's College in New York City for 12 years as part of their PPE program, Politics, Philosophy, and Economics. And so that's my kind of academic background, is teaching philosophy. My dissertation was on Plato, although it was on his metaphysics, not on politics and other things. But one of the wonderful things that I love about ancient philosophy, one of the reasons I ended up focusing on it in my work, is the way that different fields are interconnected for them. So the way that the modern academy approaches the intellectual life is everything's very separate. So if you study politics in a politics department today, somewhere in the academy, you don't do any metaphysics. You maybe sort of do ethics in some places, but they mostly think of politics as independent of ethics as well. So even there, that's separate. But you're certainly not doing epistemology. You're not doing any psychology. You're not doing any science or anything. And so the disciplines are just very disconnected today in the modern academy. In the ancient world, they understood and used some divisions, but they saw them as much more interconnected. And so they viewed the world more holistically in an interconnected way. And so when you study Plato or Aristotle or other figures like that from classical philosophy, they can be going along talking about politics and justice, and then suddenly they're talking about music and harmony, and then suddenly they're talking about being and non-being and doing metaphysics, and it's just more integrated in the way that they do it. So even in studying the metaphysics and things like that, I was brought into other subjects. And then I think as you get older and you take on more responsibility in life with marriage and children, you start thinking about things like, how is my community actually being run? And what does it take to run a good community? And so I actually ended up indirectly being pulled into various kinds of social or political things along the way.
That's great. There's so much you said that I really want to unpack, but still just kind of related to your background. Did you have an understanding of Greek philosophy and just ancient philosophy as a whole before you started studying it? Or were you getting into this with just new and fresh eyes? Like, what was your schooling like before you got into college?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I had a very kind of normal for the late 20th century conservative Christian education at a little private K-8 school in Southern California, fundamentalist type background. So we did not do much with the classics or anything like that. But we did a lot with how to like read and write. And so I was actually, I think, really well prepared for later schooling. I went to a public high school, and similarly, a lot of the really destructively negative movements that are in K-12 education today hadn't quite taken hold at the suburban high school where I was, so it certainly wasn't like a God-centered education in high school by any stretch of the imagination. But it had a lot of good basic skills, at least in the kind of accelerated, honors type classes I was able to take. But I got to college with very minimal knowledge of a lot of the classical world. So it was sort of a long process as far as that sort of thing went for me. It wasn't until getting actually into grad school and realizing how siloed academia had become, and sort of thinking about what would my life look like if I taught, metaphysics or epistemology in this very narrow way, these sort of arcane technical problems, which is sort of how the academy was dealing with them, at least in the English-speaking analytic world that I was in. And I just couldn't see myself doing that with college students for the next 30 years. Whatever you end up studying, you end up teaching at the college level, if you find a job, which is a whole nother discussion. I just couldn't see myself sort of dealing with arcane technical problems with undergraduates for the next 30 years. I wanted things that mattered. And so as I was sort of looking around at what should I really maybe shift my focus to, I landed on ancient Greek philosophy for a couple different reasons, but not some of them knowing what I was getting into, some of them not knowing what I was getting into. So I knew enough about it to know some of what I was getting into, but I'm just very thankful for that providential, unintentional direction that I took, that for me has borne a lot of fruit over the years. As our culture, socially and intellectually and politically, continues to struggle, and it's only struggling more and more, we're in need of older models to try to measure ourselves against. Right. Obviously, we need God's word to measure ourselves against. Yes. We also need examples from history and past human thought to see how other men, both pagan and Christian, have tried to do this. Right. And just, again, across the board, intellectual models, social models, political models. And so I found the classical world is really rich with that. I work more on Greek philosophy than the other parts of the classical world, but just across the board, it's incredibly valuable for getting out of our chronological snobbery, as C.S. Lewis put it, right? To measure yourself against something much bigger than the last 30 years or 50 years even, or 100 years even. So it's, so I ended up I went into it not fully knowing what I was getting into, but knowing enough about it, to get going. And I'm thankful it worked out that way.
Yes. I think that's so well said. I think you've set the table really well for us there. And just as you're speaking there, I'm thinking about how modernity really has poisoned our sensibilities in so many ways. I think what it's done is it's fractured our connection to the past, because the idea is always to be moving forward with some often undefined idea of progress. And for that reason, we no longer have an understanding of history and the lessons from it. We no longer have an understanding of just the history of thought. And we no longer have this discernment about the idea that, ideas as a whole have consequences as a whole. And we find ourselves just part of this dehumanizing machine of some kind where we're going at 1,000 miles an hour over a cliff. Basically, I think the West is in a state of suicidal intent. I don't know how else to put it, but I really think that's what's going on. And I think modernity really has played a role in all of that. And so I think everything that you're saying here, just about the importance of reminding ourselves where we've come from, is so crucial. And so, David, I think with that in mind, my first question for you is, how would we describe what Greek philosophy did in establishing Greek civilization? What are those core pillars that enabled the realization of this great empire?
Okay.
I know that's a broad question.
How much time do we have again?
We got all the time in the world.
Yeah, okay, well, that's good. We're going to need it. We're going to need it for that question. I'll just highlight a few things that I think stand out. And some, maybe more well-known than others. Obviously, there's a kind of commitment among Greek philosophy that the world is knowable and that the world is moving in a rational way. So there's a rational order behind what's happening. and that this order is not merely a result of kind of the whims of divine beings, right? So Greek polytheism, Homer and Hesiod, the stories of the Odyssey and the Iliad that are well known, that was the kind of cultural milieu of the ancient Greek world. And so what the Greeks did, the philosophers did, is challenge the polytheism, challenge the irrationality and whimsicality that's in those gods, where they do things based on whim and capriciously, and argued that there's a rational order to what's happening. And they drew upon Egypt and Babylon, the mathematical developments in Egypt and the astronomy from Babylon, which was very rational and orderly. And they put it together in a new philosophical package using new methods of argument, deductive, logical reasoning that was developed by these philosophers. So there is a rational order. It's knowable. It can be expressed in a logical order. That's prominent kind of on that side of the story. On the political side, I think the philosophers, by the time you get to Plato and Aristotle, to take them as kind of the culmination of the thing, there was a recognition of the centrality of justice and the tension or conflict that's there between the different things that human beings naturally pursue. And by that, I mean particularly the interests of individuals and families versus the interest of the community. Right. This kind of conflict maybe is well known from Sophocles' play Antigone, where you have this conflict between Antigone's duty to her family versus her duty or apparent duty to the state, and then the gods also there as well. And so trying to deal with that. And more than what went before, Plato and Aristotle articulate the centrality of justice and a balancing of interests that goes into justice, and the kind of ordering of justice as a harmony, a proportionality that gives to each what is due in virtue of the merit of the thing, the quality of the thing. So those are two things that stand out prominently, but there are whole classes and books and encyclopedias of things to be probed here, because that's just two items from the philosophy side when there's so much to that.
Yeah,
civilization that's there.
Yes, one of my things that I like to get back to very frequently is Plato's Republic. I find it just so insightful, and just fleshing out what justice is. I mean, fleshing out is an understatement. It's this rich, holistic thing. In fact, I think early on you spoke about how one of the things that's happened in academia has been this fragmentation where we don't really, we silo different disciplines together, and we don't really have this cosmological idea of how it all unites under one banner. And I think that's actually what Greek philosophers did so well. And so as Plato, in the dialogue, specifically in the Republic, in his interrogation of what justice is, I was just greatly impressed at his ability to apply it in such a robust fashion, and really getting to the core of what makes just one, a man virtuous, but an entire nation, an entire republic virtuous as a whole. Just kind of picking from that, just what are like the core things that he's trying to underscore in his articulations of that idea?
Yeah, I would say the centrality of virtue is maybe the crucial part of that. And let me try to unpack that a little bit. So there's various notions of justice that compete with each other. He's particularly concerned with two of them that are prominent in the ancient world that he thinks are a problem. The one comes from above, in the sense of being, it's the way the aristocrats typically think about it, which is, I deserve more because I have a noble birth. Given who my parents are and what blood runs in my veins, I deserve to be king. Okay. And Plato disputes that, because you can have great blood in your veins and you can be a vicious person, not a virtuous person. You can be base and lowly instead of honorable and noble. And if that's the case, you do not deserve to govern. You do not deserve to be held up for emulation. You do not deserve that status in society. If you are vicious, you deserve a low status in society, he argues. We do not honor vice, we honor virtue. And so this was a problem for aristocrats who thought they just inherit it in virtue of their blood or their positioning or their education, or I studied with so-and-so, I went to Harvard, I got a job with Morgan Stanley, I deserve XYZ PQ. And he says, no, you don't, if you are the kind of person who is pathetic. So if you lack virtue, you do not deserve to rule. So that's one. That's the kind of aristocratic, sort of a bad aristocratic error. Timocratic is what he would call it. The other is a kind of problem from below, and that's a problem for the democracies. The democracies, instead of saying, you inherit something in virtue of your birth, they say, no, everybody's equal. Everybody gets the same. And so the principle of democracy is equality. Everybody gets the same. Everybody gets to vote the same. Everyone gets to hold office the same. The ancient Democrats wouldn't think America is very democratic at all,
Right.
because we do nothing by lot or by chance. We do elections which are inherently aristocratic. People who are richer go out and campaign more. People who are good looking are more likely to get elected. People who are taller are more likely to get elected. And
More eloquent.
totally, if you can tell a good yarn, which maybe doesn't help you govern at all, doesn't make you a more virtuous person, etc. So that's already, they would say, the ancient Democrats would say, we're very aristocratic in the way that we actually do our government. The real democracy is we all put our names in the hat and we pick one name at random and that person's president. So chance and choosing by lot is actually the proper democratic system. And the ancient Greek cities that had stronger democratic elements they actually appointed a lot of offices by lot. You drew a name out of the hat, you were president for the year. And they had ways of checking and balancing you that were pretty wild, but they had ways to try to do that. But fundamentally, they thought, we are all the same, and so we are all equally qualified to serve in these offices. And so we're just going to rotate by chance, and that's how we're going to do it. And that also, to say that everybody is equal is also a mistake. We're all equal as human beings. We're all human, and therefore we're all made in the image of God. We all have the same parts to our being. We all have rational souls and material bodies, etc. We're all the same in that way, but we are not all the same in terms of morality and competence. Some are more competent than others at various things. Some are more virtuous than others. And so it's a mistake to think we're all equally qualified to serve in all these positions of honor. We're really not. Some of us are lazier than others. Some of us are dumber than others. Some of us are more indulgent than others. Some of us are more cowardly than others. Some of us are more reckless than others. So there's lots of ways to go wrong, and it's very hard to go right. But those who have settled character and competence are the ones who should be held up, that we should honor and say, this is the kind of people we want to be, is like this. These are the people we want to govern us. So there's an error from above and an error from below. And the common theme of Plato's critique there is both of those errors ignore what is genuinely valuable in terms of at the human level, which is virtue. Virtue aims at what's noble in life. And aims for actions that are noble. They use the same word for noble and beautiful. That aims for beautiful actions. We would say maybe morally excellent, morally beautiful, but beautiful actions. And that this is really what deserves to be honored in a just regime, in a just city. And so then he goes on to talk about the other virtues, as you mentioned, the Republic. That's ground zero for what come to be called the cardinal virtues in the Western tradition. So along with justice, you have wisdom, courage, and temperance or moderation. And he argues that all of those reflect the proper ordering of the different parts of the soul. That we are moderate in our appetites, we are courageous in our spirit, we are wise in our thinking. And then when you have all of those and each part doing its own, what's proper to it, what it ought to do, then it's truly just. So when we're all doing what we're supposed to do, given who we are and who God has made us to be, that's when you have justice in the city, justice in the soul. And that's a challenge to traditional aristocratic Greek thinking. It's a challenge to democratic revisionary thinking. And it's something that's taken up by the Romans. It's then taken up by the Christians. This priority of virtue in human affairs, of course, under God, is taken up.
That's so good. So, David, I've got a book idea for you.
Okay.
Where you basically have illustrate this dialogue between Plato and Marx.
Okay.
I mean, just everything that you're saying here is just so profound. And I'm thinking, okay, so these are things that have been thought about for a very long time. Marx comes in the 19th century, and he posits this idea of an egalitarian world, to some degree. And we're downstream from that, where culturally we think in fundamentally egalitarian categories.
Yeah.
And I think basically what you're saying is Plato's describing that as a recipe for disaster, because it doesn't. Well, one, it's again a dehumanizing way of thinking. It doesn't underscore things like virtue. It demonizes disparity and differences as a whole.
Yeah.
And it's hard to pursue excellence in that sort of thing, because excellence assumes distinction, right? In that sense.
Absolutely.
So,
Excellence makes you stand out from the crowd.
Right.
And standing out from the crowd is a problem for democracy. Because in democracy, we all want to receive equally, so we all want to view ourselves as being equal. Alexis de Tocqueville, in his Democracy in America, points out that democracy becomes very kind of cloying in its conformity. It kind of requires conformity, and it's very hostile to distinctions. And so I think you're absolutely right. This is definitely a feature that's a problem in the modern world. But I would say not only for kind of the Marxist world, which is obviously the communist, definitely destroys any distinction. But democracies also really struggle with allowing for distinction, proper distinctions, real distinctions. It's really an obstacle, right? Even the differences between male and female pose major difficulties for democracies. We're 100 years into our experiment in female suffrage, just for one example that sort of keeps popping up in the cultural world. But any kind of distinction, even like should women have to register for the draft, that's viewed as like unjust if they don't, because we're all supposed to be the same. We're all supposed to be interchangeable cogs in a machine, like you mentioned. And so we should all be able to do the same things. We should all have the same responsibilities. We should all just be like little Lego pieces that get, removed and put back together in all kinds of random ways. And all that denies there's some kind of underlying structure and order to the world that we don't choose. That's not just a result of our equal wills imposing ourselves on the world, but a real order of being in the things that are there that God has made, and that they're not all the same. But it's sad too, right? Because in ignoring that underlying order, we ignore all the beauty and richness that's there, right? What are we going to do? Just uncover another Lego that just looks just like all the other Legos? Or could we actually uncover something that's really different and interesting and fascinating in its uniqueness? And the old picture says, you can find that, you find distinctions all over the place. From the very beginning, in the Hebraic, to go to the scripture for a second, the Hebraic account, you see in Genesis 1 and 2, God creating things and distinguishing them, right? Day from night, light from dark, male from female, right? The dry land from the water, and on and on. He separates things, right? Not to keep them divided from each other, but to distinguish them from each other, to put them into a harmony, right? To put them in a harmony. Anyway, the whole pre-modern world embraced that. And there's lots of things to like about the modern world, but this tendency to sort of destroy distinction, again, whether communist, democratic, scientific, has been really problematic. And it's hard to see how it's sustainable in any real way. And it's not satisfying to the soul.
Yeah. Going back to just what you're speaking about in terms of the necessity of recognizing order as ordained by God, as we're talking about Greek philosophy here, where we're dealing with pagans who are able to have these just incredible contemplations of what reality is. How do you reconcile that? How do you reconcile their paganism with their rich insight? How should we be thinking about that?
Yeah. I do find the ancient pagans to be very interesting and often better discussion partners than modern pagans. There are individuals today who are not Christians who are wonderful to talk to, of course. They're fantastic. But in terms of like the thinking, I think these ancient pagans really are interesting. And I do think there's at a certain level, a lot of different things that they saw correctly about the created order. And I think there's a simple reason for that, which is divine grace. The theological category for it is common grace, where God restrains evil in the world to some extent everywhere, and in some places more, in some places less, in accord with his providential wisdom. And for a number of these Greek and Roman philosophers, he gave them a measure of grace to enable them to observe this about the world. I think that's simplistic, but I think it's simple. I think it works. I think it's right. That doesn't mean they're right about everything. They're not. We could spend another hour talking about things they got wrong. You mentioned Plato's Republic. I'm teaching back through that right now this term. And it's remarkable how cavalier he is about infanticide. Just take one example. The ancient pagans are really awful when it comes to the value of damaged, deformed, defective, injured, sick human life. They don't have that kind of mercy and compassion on the weak that we really ought to have. And so that's one place Christianity just blasts them out of the water, right? And that is due to their deformed conception of God, right? They don't have a God who becomes incarnate, who out of love for his creation stoops down, right? So the true God stooped down and came to us to raise us up. And so
the Logos not as an abstract, but as an actual incarnation.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they don't have that.
Right.
And so they have all kinds of failures, systemic failures that pop up in different places because of that. But they, despite that, they still saw an amazing amount, and I think are really useful for comparing and realizing that, there's not just one way to do paganism, right? There's one principle, which is a failure to recognize the true God as true God, but that it just works itself out like in a lot of different ways. But I think common grace is the basic answer there.
Yeah. Do you think that any of the ancient philosophers were acquainted with any sort of biblical thought?
Yeah.
Whenever I read them, I sometimes think to myself, surely they must have known something. Sure. Yeah. I mean, yes, just as you're saying, it's that divine grace. It is that common grace. Yeah. But sometimes their insights are just uniquely, they're profound in a way that really does seem like it ties back to biblical revelation as we know it. Yeah. Just is that something that I've come across before?
Oh yeah. So at some point, I'd like to teach a whole term on this question. Yeah. This view has been floated ever since antiquity. That Plato read the Bible. Plato read the Hebrew Bible. Plato traveled to Egypt. He met Jews in diaspora there. We know there's been Jews in Alexandria for a long time. And, was there a colony there in the high 300s? Well, that's a historical question. Did he actually travel to Egypt? Historical question. But there's this dispute about that. Thales, who's considered the first Greek philosopher by most historians of philosophy, it's disputed, but Thales might himself have been an Egyptian. If not, he certainly traveled to Egypt, and the mathematical knowledge he had clearly came from Egypt. So it's very possible. It's possible that something like that happened. I don't really see it, but again, from the ancient world, there's testimony that there's speculation about that. So Philo, who is a Jewish Platonist from the 1st century BC in Alexandria, certainly thought that was the case. You have some early Christian apologists like Justin Martyr saying that that's the case, and speculation down as late as the Reformation that that's still the case. So I don't see the evidence for that. I don't think so. I think the kind of insights you pointed out, I think what I would actually say is that common grace and natural revelation sometimes goes further than we would expect it to. It sometimes goes further than we expect it to. And God has, from Romans 1, we know God has revealed his character in creation. And we suppress that truth in unrighteousness, but again, not the same in every person, not the same in every case. We have to be highly textured about this. It just happens in lots of different ways. And in some cases, certain features of the divine majesty really, really pound us and really hit people differently. So I don't think so. I think it's more of a testimony to actually when God wants it to be this way, how far natural revelation can take you. Then there's a line, and then there's no further, right? It can't take you to the incarnation and salvation. It can take you to a lot of natural things, even a natural thing like natural religion or natural piety, which used to be something that was talked about even in the West. So even among the pagans, it was not an atheism, right? Even that's a kind of interesting thing to realize. We kind of assume today the default is atheism unless you can prove otherwise to me or something like this. And the ancient world, pre-modern world, that's absolutely not the case. The default is there's some kind of divine realm. And if you were going to try to be a really strict atheist and say there's no divine realm, that almost doesn't exist in the ancient world. There's almost nobody that takes that strong of a position. Like you can find a few maybe like pantheists who sort of deify nature itself. You can find examples of that, but that's about as far as they're willing to go in the most extreme cases, is to say there's still divine stuff. They just equate it with other things. So the default is some kind of theism or pantheism, at least, not some kind of there is no divinity. It's just atoms in motion. Even the ancient materialists think there are still gods. They're just made of material.
Yes, so. I think that's so important. There's a sense in which the ancient philosophers weren't trying to divorce logos from the mythos at all. Yeah. If anything, they were trying to reconcile those two things to some degree. But it's interesting though, David, because downstream from this, you do get Greek philosophy being a foundational stone for what we know as Western civilization today. Which I think was even that much more materialized and came to fruition with the influence of Christianity. Yeah. But a Christianity that was also still very tied to this ancient way of thinking, this ancient philosophy. Yeah. You think of someone like Augustine, for example. I don't know if you say Augustine or Augustine.
Either one's allowed. Either one's allowed. Yeah, we don't need to be too particular about that.
And I mean, he clearly was learned. He was a scholar who seemed to have an understanding of ancient philosophy, and not just him. I think with time you see this influence. Mm-hmm. How do you describe that correlation between this ancient philosophy and Christianity and its ability to come together to realize the West as we know it?
Yeah, it's a great question, because there really is, again, if you think about nature and grace, you've really got to have both. Right? God created nature, and then it fell, and then he redeemed it by grace. And so there's always going to be in Christianity kind of a looking upwards to God and then a looking downwards at what he has made and then seeing the whole. And so to a certain extent, if you can see how the philosophers, like the scientists of today, can often be very insightful in studying and looking down and studying nature. And so just like today, we like to show how Christianity is compatible with the best going science, the good science, the real stuff. We would want to show today, right, how Christianity fits with Einstein, for example. Christians have always done that and shown how what's intellectually best at the current moment points towards Christianity and is consistent with Christianity and is, in fact, the world that God has made and what we would expect him to make in the best cases. That doesn't mean you buy everything going on in the current intellectual world, because even the current intellectual world, like at every moment, has had internal fights. There's lots of different intellectual camps today, and there were for Augustine, and there were for Aquinas, and there were for Calvin, and there have been through history. There's debates that are happening constantly. But Christians have always tried to show how the best and truest intellectual work at the moment that they're in supports Christianity, doesn't lead to hostility with it. So a lot of this today falls under like Christian apologetics and trying to defend the faith against bad attacks on it and so forth, and show the consistency and harmony. Consistency is a very logical term, right? Harmony and fit between theology and revelation and observations of nature. So to some extent, like seeing Augustine working with Plato is a lot like just us working with Einstein, and trying to show how they fit together. So, and again, along the way, you beat up a lot of other people. So Augustine beats up on all kinds of philosophers. He singles out the Platonists for special favor because the Platonists, compared to most other ancient philosophers, were much more insistent on the immortality of the soul. And so Christians are like, that's correct. Right. The soul is immortal. The soul doesn't die with the body. And so compared to a lot of other ancient schools, the Platonists kind of rise to the fore for Augustine as well as for other early Christians. The Platonists get a unique status among the various camps for Christianity, at least up until Aquinas and later discussions when Aristotle becomes the favorite. But part of my view is that Aristotle is just Platonism plus. He's a Platonist.
Yes. And
I gave a recent talk at Disputatio on this that I think's up on the website that sort of lays out a little bit of that case.
Yeah.
So hopefully that kind of makes sense, but it's a nature grace issue, I think. And I do think Christianity enables you to see nature in a way that the unredeemed mind can't. So it's not that you have a perfectly stable understanding of nature and then you just sort of slap grace on top like it's a layer on a cake. It's not like that. It sinks in, it permeates, it infects, it disturbs, and it puts the understanding of nature into a whole new setting. So it doesn't just leave it untouched. So it's not like you just take Plato and slap Christ on the top. You don't do that. You take Christ and you squeeze the parts of Plato that are true as understandings of nature and the created order and so forth. You take that as true when it fits into the Christian picture.
That's so well said. One idea that's often put very simply is just the idea that all truth is God's truth.
Yeah.
And so understanding that even in Plato or Aristotle's contemplation of reality, that is because God enabled them first and foremost to see it and have that kind of insight. Yeah. And where they're wrong, we do have that objective standard where we can discern truth from error in that sense. Yeah. So David, Greek civilization was great. They had this vast empire. Of course, we've been talking about Plato. Aristotle builds on that. He mentors perhaps the greatest military leader of all time, and Greece just elevates itself. Yeah. But then comes Greece's demise as well. And on one hand, I wonder, I guess this is kind of my theory, my working theory is the death of Alexander prompts, in a sense, the death of the philosopher king, and the death of Aristotle, in a sense, prompts the death or the separation between philosophy and the whole of life. To what degree can we point to that as the beginning of Greece's demise? And if there's more to it, what else should we be looking at to sort of understand that?
Well, unless the seed first falls to the ground and dies, the new plant cannot spring up. And of course, Plato, Aristotle, Alexander, they all died. Right. But the plant sprung up, the new life sprung up. And although they passed, Greek ideas did not die with them. And of course, they're preserved in the Romans in all kinds of direct ways. Cicero being one obvious example, where he labors to try to translate Greek philosophy into Latin and is responsible more than anyone else for Greek ideas coming into the Latin world. You can look at a whole bunch of different Roman philosophers who studied with the Greeks, even though this is hundreds of years later, first century BC, first century AD, this period. They would study with the Greek philosophers and then seek to apply it to the moment that they're in. A wonderful example of this is the philosopher and statesman Plutarch, who wrote the famous Parallel Lives in the early 2nd century AD. And he's himself a Greek, but he's a Roman citizen, right? Because the Roman Empire is dominating the whole Mediterranean at this point. But he's a Greek native from Cheronea in Greece, and so he's conversant in both worlds, and writes these incredible Parallel Lives, as well as a ton of essays that survive, offering practical advice and counsel to Roman statesmen. And he knew many Roman statesmen personally. Emperor Trajan's closest advisors, he knew them personally, and was writing these lives to advise them, among other things. So it basically doesn't die. Just like the Greek language doesn't die, right? It is still, hundreds of years later, still the common tongue for a lot of these areas. So too, the Greek philosophy doesn't die. Thankfully, some bad parts die, but the good parts get preserved and sustained into the future. And Christendom, of late antiquity and the medieval period, really is a kind of synthesis of a number of different factors. I mean, the Christian religion obviously being the predominant one, right? Like, it's Christendom. It's not anything else dumb, right? It's Christendom. Right. That's the domus, right? That's the domination. So it's a Christendom, but it's not a kind of globalism. Okay, yes. So it's a culturally specific thing that emerged in specific places, especially places that were Greek or Roman in the background. And so you have this kind of Christianity coming to a time and place, right? Christianity doesn't just come in the abstract, right? Christ comes in time and place. He comes to Greece and Rome. Obviously, he comes in the ancient Near East to places where that's the language, that's the political power, right. That's where he comes. And so it's that thing that gets directly transformed. Yeah. And so Christendom emerges from there, and it doesn't just stay the same either, right? Because Rome doesn't last that long. Right. It's already an empire, not a republic, by the time you get the 1st century AD. And it only lasts a couple hundred years in the Western Roman Empire, and it's very rocky. And from then, you have this huge process of taking Christendom to the barbarian tribes, the Germanic tribes, the other kinds of migrating hordes. They have to become Christianized too. And so a lot of the early medieval period is this wild stuff, right, where we're dealing with the Vikings and we're dealing with these German tribes, and it's not just like Greece and Rome anymore, right? It's also now this kind of German barbaric spirit that needs to be Christianized. And when you look at what's happening in France in this period, like it's just wild stuff. You think of Charlemagne and all this stuff. All that to say, I don't think Greek philosophy dies. It lives on in Rome, and then it lives on in all kinds of places in the late ancient world. Even people directly still doing philosophy in the Greek language, as well as Christians using it. Not only the Western fathers using it indirectly, but the Eastern fathers, obviously more directly. It lives on. And it's a part of, it's a secondary player in like you said, in Christendom, which is this combination of cultural and intellectual particularities to places and the universal reality of God's kingdom coming in the world.
David, I really appreciate you getting into that, because I think that this is a way of thinking that I think has been lost in the modern West, where we don't really understand the history of where the West came from and what it is now, and understanding ancient philosophy, understanding Christendom and what it did with all of that, the significance of Christ coming when he did, the language in which we have the New Testament, for example, like all of that is not coincidental. That is very intentional. That's God doing something with that moment. And now we have this Western civilization as we know it now, but that's its foundation. That's where it's come from. David, where do you think we began to lose sight of this? How have we lost an understanding or comprehension of history and where we've come from? Just what's your answer, your theory for why the West is what it is today?
Yeah, it's a big historical question. Everybody usually finds their whipping boy. You know, it's all John Duns Scotus's fault for introducing nominalism, right, which is ridiculous. It's all Descartes' fault for his Cartesian dualism. It's all Luther and Calvin's fault for breaking up, the one church. Everyone sort of finds their preferred whipping boy. I doubt that there's a single moment, that you can pin it on, or a single thing. If the thing that's going to always be the thing is going to be the loss of true faith. And so with the loss of true faith, where that arrives intellectually, where that arrives culturally, that's when it falls apart. You can actually handle a lot of disorder within genuine faith. And so when I look at it, I increasingly think that that's probably the best principle that's there. But again, it sort of falls.
That's so profound, David. Say it again. The idea between faith and order in that sense. I thought that was so profound.
Well, I doubt it was that profound. But again, if you look for just like a whipping boy in history, like when we said marriage is not a thing in the church, it's a thing that the state runs, right? So Protestants insist, because marriage is a total disaster when you get to the Reformation period. That's what does it. And then you have the secular public sphere, and then you're doomed, and so forth. Even though, obviously, the Reformers did not want a secular or religiously neutral public sphere. That's wild. So you can try to pinpoint all these things, but none of them in isolation is really going to do the trick, I don't think. What does the trick is a loss of faith. And then when you lose faith and idolatry takes hold of whatever form it's going to be, it's then that all the other dysfunctions or other problems that were present are not restrained properly anymore, right? So you can handle quite a bit of disorder if it's disordered piety, like in the sense that Christianity can help maintain some of these things from bursting out and letting all their following out these bad things to their bad consequences. It can help restrain them in various ways, right? So to take a shot at contemporary evangelicals, if you look at the fertility rate of contemporary evangelicals, it's disastrous. It's not that much different from the world around us. We really are going along with a lot of normal mores of the culture when it comes to fertility and timing of marriage and things like this. Hopefully that's changing. We can pray that that's changing. But we look a lot like the world in certain areas, and yet it doesn't cause the same level of dysfunction when it's in a Christian household or a Christian community. You don't see all of the disorders you see in the secular world as badly as in the Christian subcultures. So anyway, it's a long story. It's a bigger discussion, but Christianity, none of us are going to be perfect. There's no perfect community. We're all works in progress by divine grace. But when piety and faith is present, it can help more so constrain some of these bad impulses, and we don't work out the implications in the same way in our lives. At least that's my working theory at the moment. Mostly because I think the spiritual explanation is likelier to work compared to these sort of more spiritual or material, not spiritual, like historical material things that try to point to this one intellectual move or this one, technological change or something like that. I don't think the printing press is going to cause the downfall of the West. Yeah, exactly. It can be if it's used with faith, we'll figure it out.
Yeah, that's good. But speaking of which, I think in that sense there's different iterations of this, but this split between even faith and philosophy, or just
Yeah.
to make that more concrete, just theology and philosophy, where people kind of treat theology as the God-ordained, God-sanctioned form of thought that we ought to pursue, and philosophy as its negative antithesis that should be done away with. And then you get someone, for example, like Van Til, I think, who comes and he tries to actually say, like, no, actually, theology literally is philosophy, but with the undergirdings of Christ, who reconciles it all together. Do you see that fracture between theology and philosophy in the way that I've described it as perhaps one of the reasons that I think the church has been, I'd say, intellectually impotent in its influence in more modern times, where we've become more Gnostic and siloed into our own little corner? Do you have any thoughts around that at all?
See, you're increasingly getting me off of my core competencies, but because I'm inclined to say, more than just like rejecting philosophy, it's more the embracing of bad philosophies that will tend to cause the trouble. And half the time, if you just say, let's just reject all philosophy, what that really means is, I just want to uncritically imbibe the current moment's philosophy. And I think as we continue various Protestant ressourcement projects, we're seeing that to different degrees. I think, and I don't think any particular tradition is fully, freed of that particular problem. So I think it's more that we've imbibed bad philosophies than that we've really successfully disentangled ourselves from it. But I do think this sort of conflict narrative is problematic. I do think it will lead to unsustainable cultures if we try to do that. And for similar reasons that I criticized democracy earlier, I think actually, like it's sort of going to treat all thinking, other than like biblical exegesis, it's going to treat all thinking as like equally bad or something. And it's a little strange, but we don't really do that in our business endeavors. We don't say, well, everybody, let's just look at the Bible to do our business endeavors, right? It just doesn't make sense, right? You want biblical principles, but then you have to go look at stuff, right? And so, but when you get looking at stuff, you end up doing philosophy. You're not gonna be able to stop that. So we don't do that when it comes to economics or technology. And then as you keep going, you realize you have some conception of creation that you're working with, then you're just doing philosophy at that point. So I think that conflict narrative is not great. I think you should think of it again in terms of like nature and grace, and obviously those are going to be complementary, right? And you have fallen nature, so always feel free to go after bad conceptions of nature. Go after it with a vigor, but you don't want to go after it so much that you destroy nature. God didn't destroy nature; He's in the process of redeeming it. So,
yeah, so well said. So you and I guess by virtue of us sitting here, we're both with New St. Andrews College. You teach there. I work here, and there's a sense in which we're sold out for enculturating students in the ways of virtue and truth. We want our students to graduate as people who will carry the banner of Christ. In your teaching, in your classrooms, what are you hoping your students are going to walk away with that will enable them to be these leaders in culture? Just what's your goal specifically? What are you aiming for?
Yeah. Well, like you said, it's a big team project here, and not just one of information transfer, but of personal formation.
Yes.
The real like learning outcome is our students, right? And who they become when they leave. And so when I think about the role of philosophy in that, like you actually, what you mentioned is what I would emphasize. I would hope to emphasize, which is wisdom and virtue, which I think is something that the best of philosophy from the past has emphasized as necessary not only for personal life and for a well-lived life, but especially necessary for those who are leaders in any community. It's bad if you fail in a business deal. That's bad for you and your family. If you fail in a community deal, that's bad for the whole community, right? And so leaders have a lot of responsibility as a result of that. And it's even more important that we cultivate men and women of character and of virtue and of wisdom, because they're going to need that to govern. And from Plato to Plutarch to Augustine and on, that's, I think, should be the main contribution of philosophy. So there's the character side that I would emphasize. And then there's kind of the holistic side of like how to understand creation and think about what's out there. And I think along with the things that I've said, I would stress that, we often imbibe a kind of view of creation where all that God made was matter in motion. And we think this is just atoms. And all this stuff is just atoms, and we're all just atoms. And then there's God, and then there's just atoms. And I don't think we realize that is a very unusual view historically, and that's a view that we don't need to embrace, and that God could create things other than atoms. He could create things that are non-physical, that are part of the order and structure of the world. And so I think trying to aim for a richer conception of nature, where nature is not just atoms and therefore red in tooth and claw, and therefore it's just leads you to a kind of individualistic, pleasure-seeking, power-seeking life. If you think that, you're thinking like Thomas Hobbes, okay? You're thinking like a degenerate modern person. You're not thinking about that in the way that a classical Western person would, I would argue. And so nature is not only matter in motion, it's also form. It's also purpose.
Teleology.
It's got teleology to it, which is the purposefulness.
Right.
It's got form and structure and order to it. And it has people in it as well. And so it's got all of these rich structures that can be studied, these forms, these universals that are part of the created fabric, so that when you see what's happening, it's not just atoms in motion moved by will. It's natural structures that move teleologically and purposefully, each thing according to its kind, right? As Genesis 1 says. And as we see in Genesis 2, Adam identifies these different categories. He applies names to them, to the things that God has made in Genesis 1, the divisions God has put there. Adam assigns names to them in Genesis 2, and whatever he names them is what they will be called. And so the structure in the world, and then the fittedness of our minds to be able to grasp the essential features of that structure. In addition to working on our character, that's part of the picture that I think Christendom needs for the 21st century and beyond, that we have to establish firmly in our minds and hearts that the world is not just matter in motion, that we don't want to give nature over to that kind of thinking.
Yeah, I think that's so well said, David. Something you said as well is just how you made the reference to how you're trying to produce students who are going to go on and govern with virtue.
Yeah.
You use that word govern.
Yeah.
What's the necessity of using that word? Is that what we want our students to go on and do, to actually govern and rule and lead?
Well, I think we forget how much every able-bodied adult is actually doing that. Right? So if you think about any society, it's always got the young and it's always got the old who are too weak to effectively accomplish things, right? The old can advise, and that is crucial. And the young are our future. They're obviously crucial. But if you think of like able-bodied adults, right, that's already like a fraction of the population. And then there's some who are sick, and then there's some who are infirm, and then there's some who have mental handicaps, and on and on. Like, if you are an able-bodied adult, you actually have a responsibility in the world. And governance is not only what the president does. You start with self-governance, and the old and the young who can't handle themselves have to be governed by others, but we should be people who can govern ourselves under God and in conformity to the rules of our society as well. We drive on the right-hand side, not the left, so forth in America. So we should be able to govern ourselves. And then there are families to govern. So husband and wife are both governors in the family over the children, over the sick, over any young unmarrieds who are living with us at the time, and so forth. So the household is a political unit as well that the wife has real governance in. So it's not just men, women need this too. There's civil society, the organizations of civil society, there's the church. And then there are larger positions of leadership within that civil society, not just the free private associations, but the public associations of the city and the state. And it's there that surely we need to have men of character to lead those institutions and to occupy these positions of magistracy that are going to be there. And we absolutely want to, at New St. Andrews, to punch above our weight. We want to be a small but incredibly vigorous place. And an interesting model for that, not in every way, but in one way, is ancient Sparta. Again, to go back to my wheelhouse. Thucydides writes of Sparta that when later people come and investigate the physical remains at Sparta, they will never believe how powerful Sparta was. They won't believe it because Sparta didn't build big buildings and on. And I think we should, but that's not the point here. The point here is that they were a small group of people. They were probably at their height something like 15,000 male citizens.
Yeah.
15,000. And they dominated not only all of southern Greece in the Peloponnese, but they were the most prominent Greek city in projecting power beyond the borders of Greece at all kinds of various times. They were this tiny group. And why were they able to do that? It's because they lived an incredibly rigorous way of life. They had a distinctive way of life that was shocking to other Greek cities, and it appalled many of them, but it impressed many of them as well. I certainly wouldn't want to live in Sparta. I don't want to revive Sparta, but the kind of spirit of we are really doing something, and this is something grand and something worth doing. And now, as Christians, right, this is something worth doing for God and for Christ. Which doesn't mean we're just going to train every day. We're going to feast and laugh as well as fight. But we really have to be intentional about becoming like people, like a certain kind of person, a person of substance. And that's true for the men and the women. And that's necessary, especially necessary for those who will govern and lead in lots of different roles, lesser and greater, all of which are good and proper callings for Christians.
That's just excellent, David. Well, David, thank you. It's been such an honor and a privilege conversing with you on this important topic. We could have gone on for hours, honestly.
We could. There's a lot of good things to talk about. Yeah.
You're absolutely right. But as we end, what would you like us to toast to, David?
Let's toast to God and His justice and His grace.
Amen. Cheers.
Amen.